You are one of you're one of the most requested people I get.
Really?
Yeah. And that's
Oh,
in the sense that there's a handful to clarify, there's a handful of people who actually request people.
yeah,
Yeah. And in that, oftentimes they're random people I've never heard of, and
yeah,
nobody's ever mentioned them previously, and nobody mentions them again afterwards.
yeah.
However, there's easily like 5 or 6 different times that people have explicitly asked for Dr. Rosalind Watts on the show.
Oh, that's so nice. So weird. That's so nice.
Well, you do have a TED Talk after all.
Yeah. That's true. It gets out there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Why don't we drop in and see what
yeah.
happens?
Let's do it.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Gesso. Big thanks to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube, as well as in the description to this episode. Those people have been giving significantly, some of which for a long time. That's why their names are in the credits. And also, big thanks to all of my patrons. Much appreciated for your help, because without it, there would be no podcast for any of us. So, thank you. If you're not yet a patron and would like to become one, please do so by heading to jameswgesso.com/support to see your support options. Patrons of $8 or more get access to a private Dropbox folder where all of the podcasts are there without ads. Some of the podcasts now have ads in the audio version. Of course, the video version is on YouTube, so there are ads, but you get ad-free access as well as access to a bunch of released and unreleased talks, lectures, books, and even some music. So check that out at patreon.com/JamesWGesso or jameswgesso.com/support to become a patron. So this episode is with Dr. Rosalind Watts. Before we get into it, I'll make a quick mention. This episode is the first episode that is existing alongside my new second channel, which is going to focus on short clips of each episode. I've been working with someone who has been helping me get some timestamps for different clips from different episodes, and I'll be working on getting those clips out. Yeah, I had like clips on the main channel, but I've decided to move it to a secondary channel because of the algorithms and all the rest, and really double down on making lots of short shareable clips from the show to help sort of increase the analytics and the reach and all the rest, and then also helping the info that's in it get out to people. So if you can, please follow my clips channel. I'll put a link to it in the description to this episode. If you're on YouTube, it's just popping up right there in the little info box, card box. So jump over and subscribe to it. Thank you very much. And that is the only announcement. Please do that. So let's hear a little bit more about Dr. Rosalind Watts. Dr. Rosalind Watts is a clinical psychologist and serves as the clinical lead of the Imperial College London Psilocybin for Depression study. Her qualitative research indicated connectedness and acceptance as fundamental mechanisms of change in psilocybin therapy. She developed the Watts Connectedness Scale and a therapeutic framework for conducting preparation and integration sessions in psychedelic therapy trials known as the ACE model, Accept, Connect, Embody. Rosalind has written about psychedelics as agents of connectedness and given a number of talks on the subject, including a popular TEDx talk. I'll mention this again at the end, but Dr. Watts is teaching a multi-day workshop on her process around Accept, Connect, Embody in London of 2020. Links to that will be in the show notes, and I'll mention again at the end of the episode. This conversation went really well. I really liked talking with Dr. Watts, and I felt like it's just generally, I think, a really great episode, as the all the information is flying around right now about psilocybin and its efficacy for treating depression, and some of which is really accurate, some of which is maybe misrepresentative of the actuality of the research. And so having the clinical lead of those studies on the show to talk about it and the larger nuances around the results of treating depression with psilocybin is great. I think it's great, and I think you're going to like it too. It's one of the longer episodes, and yeah, I enjoyed myself. Am I belaboring that point? Possibly. Either way, I hope you enjoy it as well. And without further ado, here is my interview with Dr. Rosalind Watts on Adventures Through the Mind. Okay, so Dr. Rosalind Watts, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thank you.
Nice to see you again. I hope you're doing well this morning.
Yeah, thank you very much. You too.
So I watched your talk from Breaking Convention this morning, actually, and we've had a few talks together about the scope of your work, and I felt like before we get into sort of the scope of your perspective on working with psilocybin specifically for depression, maybe to start with a general overview so people get a sense of what the current state of the research is with your team. So like, what is your team's current state of research with psilocybin for depression?
So we did the pilot study, which was an open label study with 20 participants a couple of years ago now. And it's taken us that long to prepare for the current study, which is a larger trial. And it has 60 participants in total. It will have. We're halfway through at the moment. And we are comparing psilocybin with escitalopram, which is an SSRI antidepressant medication. So, we are going to be finishing that at about July or August next year. And the primary outcome of the study is going to be brain scan data. But we're also looking at changes in depression scores too. Mm-hmm. And some other measures. We have these huge batteries of measures. So all the participants have to fill in so many questionnaires, which they're incredibly patient with. But it's amazing because it means that we can just analyze so many different factors and aspects of the experience. So we'll have lots of amazing data when the study finishes.
And this is at the newly minted Psychedelic Research Center at Imperial?
Yeah. So we had some amazing donations, which has enabled Robin to start a center. And we're going to be doing some really exciting new projects with psilocybin after this one as well. So we're going to be looking at psilocybin for anorexia and potentially some other exciting studies too. So good time.
Yeah, and you mean Robin Carhart-Harris?
Yeah.
Great. What was the results of your last research with psilocybin for depression? Obviously, the results were positive enough to make world news and to justify, the forward progression of clinical research, even to the point of opening a center that focuses on it. What were you seeing insofar as people, what was the context of their depression? And then after the psilocybin sessions with your team, what was the general outcome acutely and then over time as well?
Yeah. So people in that study had suffered with severe depression for on average 18 years. So that was the mean length of depression suffered. Some people there had it their whole lives, and people had tried up to like 20 different types of antidepressant medication and up to 6 different courses of talking therapy. So it was a sample of people with what is termed treatment-resistant depression, although I really don't like that term. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's very accurate. I think I don't think these people are resistant to treatment, that we just haven't found the right treatments yet.
Totally agree.
But it's a really unhelpful title, isn't it?
Yeah.
Treatment-resistant.
Well, it puts the responsibility of the it puts the failures of the treatment on the patient. It's like it's the patient's fault. They're resistant to the treatment, which is not good medicine paradigm.
Yeah. So they had suffered for a very long time, and most of them came to the study because they were just desperate to try something new. And so it wasn't a sample of people that were psychedelic enthusiasts. They weren't psychonauts. A couple of them had tried LSD like decades previously and had pretty terrible experiences. So they were not coming into the study with a kind of positive expectation necessarily that it was going to help them. And actually a couple of the couple of the participants actually had very negative reactions from their GPs when they said they were going to be in the study. Their GPs warned them against it and said, it's, really harmful thing to be doing. So that's, I mean, this is a side point, but it's very interesting actually that seems to have changed over the course of the two studies, that we're not seeing that same thing in our current study, which is amazing. It seems that the attitudes of the medical profession based on that little small case study have changed in some way. Anyway, so people were very, very, suffering for a long time. And then they came to the study, and for out of the 20, the most common response was that they would immediately report relief from depression. So they would immediately, like the next day, come in and say, my depression feels like it's lifted. I'm not ruminating. I feel different. And that effect would unfortunately wane after a couple of months, sometimes like 5 or 6 weeks, but that for most of them, after about 2 to 3 months, that sense of openness and almost like being freed from the cage of depression, it was like the kind of cage walls started to close in a bit again. So we weren't seeing a permanent change, but not to take away from how important it was for those people that, having had all these different treatments and nothing worked, to have the experience of an immediate relief that lasted for weeks or months was really profound. So that was for 11 people. They had this 2 to 3 month respite. For 6 of them, they had over 6 months of being depression free, which is really amazing. And I think all of them now, actually, because we stay in touch with people, have described that their depression has returned. So yeah, but we did see for people that, 6 months or maybe a year or a little bit longer even, they were reporting that they were still in remission. And then for 3 people, it didn't work at all. They didn't have any benefit really. I mean, a tiny, but non-significant change in their depression scores. And they described that it didn't really work for them, that they didn't really, so 2 of them didn't have any perceptual changes in the high dose session. And one of them had perceptual changes and saw visions, but he just reported that it was just completely other. He couldn't hold on to any of it, didn't seem to get any insights or sense of healing. It was more just a very odd experience that he couldn't really engage with. So overall, it worked for 17 of the 20.
So there's there's a couple pieces there that I think would be interesting to unpack. One of which might be maybe one of the most challenging questions, but one that's most relevant in this moment, which is that the anecdotal reports of, I took this many grams and I still felt nothing, seems to, they're not entirely common, but obviously, with the internet, they're easy to find these days. And I'm curious if since then, you've followed up, done, further research or conferred with other colleagues to get a sense of why it might be that people are resistant. I know previously, people are resistant. People aren't experiencing effects. I'd like to be clear that that's what I mean. I know previously with the work of Stan Groff with LSD, he had mentioned that he had felt it had something to do with a compulsive holding in the psyche, that once they fed them enough LSD to break that, I think in one point I had read something like 1,500 micrograms. Then after that, they could give them a normal person's dose. But possibly there are other things happening here. So I'm just curious what you've come to learn at this point.
Well, it's one of the things that in our team we've been most interested in. So we have in the current psilocybin for depression study, the larger study, we have this amazing team of us. It's a really wonderful team. There's 6 of us. We've been all of us completely absorbed in this world of learning about what's happening. So we are kind of on WhatsApp discussing the final points at like 11 o'clock at night and 6 in the morning. We're just all in this absolute bubble of psilocybin for depression and really enjoying learning and developing tentative hypotheses and sharing them. So we have talked as a group at length about this topic. Because we've seen it in the current study as well. As you mentioned, there are these anecdotal reports, and for sure we've seen it again that for some people it doesn't seem to work. And I think that's very interesting what you say about Stan Grof and this holding on. And I feel that there is this sense of, the idea that we've come up with is that for some people, it is just so hard to trust that even in our setting where we spend a lot of time building that trust and have, good number of hours of preparation first, and they're in a very safe setting, that for some people there is this holding on because it just doesn't feel safe, and that they might be people that actually, upon reflection, when we think about them in the screening, that we might actually have felt on an interpersonal level a slight, that we think that we're starting to develop a sense for what that might look like earlier on. So we're starting to develop a kind of intuition about which people are the people that would probably need a lot more support in order to be able to let go. And so we might not say yes to them in the study because actually we can only offer what we can offer. So if people have a lot of trauma in their past, but that is manifesting in a distance interpersonally, it's when we feel that it's hard to connect with somebody, and we feel that it takes a bit more time to build that rapport, we realize that seems to be, I mean, we're talking about such small numbers here that we can't make any really firm conclusions, but yeah, my sense would be that dose would certainly come into it, and that for these people, if we'd given them a much bigger dose, then maybe they would have been just this kind of breakthrough. They wouldn't have been able to hold on. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly like this image in my mind is like if somebody kind of jumping off a cliff and or like abseiling. Like I remember once I went abseiling and I was so petrified of the whole thing.
Wait, abseiling's like paragliding?
No, so like, okay, so basically you stand with your back to a cliff edge and you have a rope, and what you do is you like jump down and you go down the cliff backwards jumping. Do you know what I mean? Have you seen it? So you're holding onto the rope, you're facing the cliff or the mountain, and what you have to do in order to do that is you have to let go and then hold on again. So you go down in these like jumps. So you have to let go of the rope, but then you hold on again so you don't fall all the way down. So you just let go and hold. So there's a lot of trust involved. And I remember doing this exercise when I was like 15 at some school trip. And whereas other people were able to jump off and let go and hold, so they would go down like that, I couldn't let go. So I held my hands on the whole way down. At the bottom, my hands were bleeding because rather than letting go, I just held on to the rope the whole time. And I feel like with some people, it's a bit like that rather than letting go, they are just going to hold on, even if it means that their hands are going to bleed, that some part of them just is too frightened to let go. So, I think that maybe with those people, if you give them a really high dose, it's almost like that person on the mountain, like just pushing them off. But I also wonder whether rather than going straight to that, it might be better for us to develop models where we give people that need it so much more preparation and so much more support that actually, and also start with a smaller dose, getting a bit higher, that for those people, they might be led more gently into feeling safe enough to feel something. Because I also know from ayahuasca circles that there'll often be one person that doesn't experience anything. There'll be one person in a ceremonial space that just says that the medicine isn't working. Someone who was talking about that the other day, it's like the nada experience. And I just wonder whether it would be very interesting to kind of interview all those people, get them all together and interview them and try and work out whether there was some, maybe unconscious, but sense of unsafety in the environment because of how they were feeling that day, or just not feeling quite safe to let go.
Yeah, I think safety is an interesting interesting consideration. And I also want to probe a little bit more because I don't think this is what you mean, although what you had said could have been interpreted as though this was a choosing,
Oh,
that there was like a choosing of resistance. And I'm just wondering
yeah,
about, obviously, it's not like I can just choose not to experience my psilocybin. And
yeah,
there's sort of like a neurobiological choice that's being made. So I actually heard from somebody maybe about 2 months ago who asked me my opinion on what they should do because they deeply, deeply wanted the experience and they've been giving themselves crazy amounts of mushrooms and still nothing's happening. Um, and so, can you maybe unpack a little bit more
yeah,
on that difference?
yes. It's certainly not. I mean, because if you think about the people in the study, they've put themselves through immense inconvenience to be there, and they really, really want it to work. It's certainly not a conscious choice. It's more about um, what they're able to. Yeah, what I think it probably links to polyvagal theory
Oh,
in some way.
great. Yeah, I'm there with you.
But
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think about how I'm gonna, because yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to speak about this with any proficiency because it's something that I'm only just really discovering myself. But I think that there's the ventral vagal and there's this dorsal vagal pathway, and from what I understand it is that when somebody's system is overwhelmed with unsafety, that there's a shutting down,
Hmm.
and I wonder about whether in that position there are mechanisms that we don't even know about. Like, I don't know how the system responds. Like, I had a conversation with somebody who was talking about the body's releasing of opiates under certain conditions of stress. So whether that could counteract a response to psychedelics or something. Like, on a neurobiological level, I'm sure that there are processes that kick in that might put the brakes on. If something feels so dangerous for the organism, then the organism shuts down. The dorsal vagal kind of playing dead.
Hmm.
So I wonder whether that has an impact. I mean, I think that's one subset. I think the shamanic interpretation would be different. I know there is this idea of the nada experience. I can't remember the details of it, but I'm sure there is an explanation of what that's about. And I guess what my supervisor would say, who's a holotropic breathwork expert and amazing psychiatrist and has lots of experience in altered states and working with it's through the holotropic breathwork paradigm, but much of it is very applicable to psychedelics. He would just say, it's kind of what the person is ready for and what is right for them at the time,
Hmm.
which I think is a very compelling way of seeing it, that the organism, there's this homeostatic balancing system. And if actually your system doesn't need a big jolt, then you're not going to get a big jolt. But I think that rationale would sound very difficult for the person you're talking about, who is really seeking something and nothing's happening. It
Hmm.
would be probably difficult for him to buy into the idea that that's what was right for him.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so I wonder whether the person you're talking about, whether with him, was it a man?
I'm not going to reveal their gender, but you could
Okay,
say him in the default way. Yeah. Yeah.
so with him, I wonder whether if he was to work with somebody over a longer period of time, um, maybe do some breath work together, maybe do some other kinds of intervention together, build up a real sense of trust and safety, and try much smaller doses first of all, rather than trying to go for these huge doses, and building up just to see if there's anything, and having an approach of curiosity. So rather than hoping for the big breakthrough, going into the experience with the intention of being open to whatever comes up and just being curious as to any changes there might be, but not really being so attached to that outcome. And just over time, building up. I wonder whether in that circumstance, after a few months of that kind of work, maybe there would be more potential for experiencing the stronger effects. But of course, how do you do that? And when psychedelics are illegal,
Right.
that's
Right.
the
Right. That's the big question.
that's the thing. Like, that's what's very frustrating, because the way we do it at the moment is just one tiny way of doing it. We have to jump through all these hoops to get our approvals, and and then it's so expensive to do these studies, and you do it in this very prescriptive way. And I just can't wait for when we can experiment with more protocols and different types of intervention. And I'm confident that we will work out in time. Well, of course we will. So much more about who it's right for, how we can optimize it, how we can help maximize the potential of it. But at the moment, we know so little, have so many questions. And the science has been quite divorced from a ceremony context, obviously, and the underground, where there's so much more experience. And I have actually spoken to people from those settings about this question of when it doesn't work. And there's been a variety of different responses, but I think something around having a lot of trauma that has not yet been, a lot of trauma kind of waiting back down that could respond so strongly if it were to respond that it shuts down through a kind of safety mechanism, something around that. I think it's probably the most common response. But what we are trying to do at Imperial is to start to work a bit more closely with those settings through the survey study that we do. So the psychedelic survey, we're joining up with lots of different ceremonies, retreat centers, to collect data from thousands of people that are going through psychedelic work themselves. And I think that's going to be a really good step towards answering these kind of questions, because we'll have a much bigger data set. And also with bigger numbers, you can just ask questions of the data much more easily.
Interesting. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't know whether we have specific questions on there about these kind of experiences, but there probably is. Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely several things there that had run through my mind when I got the email from that person. One of which was this, and I've seen it in others, this like very strong like call that it needs to be this, and I look at that sort of I hope that this isn't being heard by the person and perceived in a judgmental or negative way, but as like another expression of what might be the same control, hyper vigilant control tendencies that are leading to the very incapacity to feel or experience the high or the release. And definitely appreciated your mention of polyvagal theory, and just even thinking of it something akin to how somebody can just move through their day feeling totally numb, not realizing that they're deeply sad, not having any idea what sadness feels like, that they're sad, or that sort of that classic example of like, why are you so angry right now? I'm not angry. People don't even feel their anger. So possibly there's some, there's some mechanism, be it, I mean, obviously there's going to be, it's a holistic system. So if there's a response in one part of the body, then there's other responses happening, concurrently. But there's some sort of response that's dissociating the sensory experience of the psilocybin from the conscious awareness of the participant, be it related maybe to the dorsal vagal parasympathetic dissociation process. And I also liked your idea of, I think the word I'm looking for is titration, but like in reverse. So like incrementally up, maybe finding in non-drug assisted therapeutic processes, how to just like maybe open things up a little bit. Just to touch different areas. And like once those little places are open, those are cracks that the psilocybin awareness can get into and maybe push open in the process.
Absolutely. And thank you for your polyvagal description there. You're wonderful, because you can kind of synthesize so many different ideas and talk about them in a very articulate way. So yeah, that was a very lovely description of it. I think that I also really agree with this idea of going slowly and slowly opening up without the need for substances initially. So in the study, the model that we use, the preparation session has a visualization exercise. And in this visualization exercise, we ask people to imagine that they're swimming on the sea, and that they're on a boat, and then they leave the boat, and then they dive down. And the dive down is representing diving down from the ego mind, the chatter of the day to day, down through the water, getting more aware of their body, and then down to the bottom of the sea. And when they're there, there are lots of beautiful things they can look at, but there's also some dark, spiky oyster shells in the kind of cooler, darker waters. And those things represent the painful things in their life, the hard things. And they're encouraged to go right towards those shells and to open them up and see what's inside and rummage around and really be with what feelings are there, open up the shell of those feelings. And then if they stay with that for long enough, just to explore whether or not there is some learning there, and that whether this pain teaches them in some particular way or guides them towards something. So as a kind of compass director. And that we represent that as a pearl, the pearl and the oyster, the bit of wisdom, because we see so often that people's greatest pain is so linked, is so the same as their greatest value, what matters most to them. So then they get the pearl in their hand, which is what their greatest value is, or what this pain teaches them, and they swim up, and then they swim up to the surface, and then it's all about learning the lesson of that pearl and connecting it to their life and to other people, and getting a sense of new perspective. So that's the visualization. And I guess the relevance of it to what you were just saying is how in the preparation session, people don't have any psilocybin. They just do some talking about their lives, their childhoods, in a very safe place where they're witnessed and validated and given lots of time, and treated with a lot of respect. And then they do the exercise with the music on, and they just that exercise alone, without any psilocybin, people open up feelings so powerfully that they sometimes say that preparation was kind of almost as influential for them as the psilocybin experience. So we are, most of us, walking around pretty numb all the time. I mean, there are so many ways that our culture numbs us, and there are so many hugely painful processes happening in the world around us at the moment that in a way you kind of have to numb yourself a little bit, otherwise you'd be, like, it would be tough to get through the day. So many of us are numb a lot of the time, and so this kind of work is about gently helping people start to open up to those feelings. And for sure, that process, this kind of visualization or any kind of meditation that helps you go into your emotions and your feelings, is such a good preparation for psilocybin work, because so much can be done through that alone, I think. But just because I don't think people realize how much, I certainly didn't realize how much we are programmed and trained to carry on regardless of emotions, push them to the side, and how we don't want to feel those things because we're kind of conditioned to see them negatively, and they're uncomfortable, and we're not given, our culture and society doesn't have the structures and the rituals that we need to go through those kind of pains, because it's so hard going through those things. And to go through them, we need other people around us, we need rituals to support it, we need all of those layers of things you can do to support someone going into that kind of thing. But we don't have them. We're supposed to be at work at this time. We're, like that time, we're going on public transport systems. We're battling our way through the day, lots of competition, lots of having to put a brave face on it and seem okay, trying to be productive and strong. And I don't think we realize what it really feels like to let an emotion come in and take hold and get bigger, and to let your body be overwhelmed by that emotion until you're shaking and crying or shouting, and your rage is coming out of your hands, and you're punching a pillow, and you to really feel the full expression of those emotions that we carry around in us. It takes time and space and support and guidance, and it's something that we're all, many of us are sorely lacking in our lives. So even with psilocybin, I think those practices of embodying our trapped emotions is really important, especially at this time we find ourselves in at the moment.
Yeah, there's a lot there too. You're such a rich person to talk with. This feeling. I recently I went to see Stephen Jenkinson do a performance of Nights in Grief and Mystery, and he told a story of a woman who had gotten a cancer diagnosis, who was a palliative care nurse, and then calls back then a few days later to find out that that everything came back negative, essentially. And then she started, the story is really powerful. I'm not going to tell the story, but the point is he talked about listening to her go through these different layers of crying. And he had all these terms for it. It was like, first there was sobbing, and then there was crying, and then there was wailing. And at some point he got to a point where he said it was keening. And he said, keening is like the apex of the expression. and that the body can't hold it for very long. It's like the top of the mountain. But if you don't
Yeah.
go all the way up before you come back down, then it's not going to be finished.
Yeah.
And so I think about that. I thought about that as you were talking, and also thinking about just how much my psilocybin experiences have sort of gave me the opportunity to, over time, learn to be more with my feelings as they arise, and more attentive of how my environment does or does not support or allow consciously or neurobiologically those emotions to arise, as well as just the value of, like feeling emotions is one thing, being able to be there, like you had mentioned, but then to be able to be in a context where there's lots of cues of safety, and the interpersonal neurobiology of being with someone, holding a grounded space of compassion, can create a sort of a healthy compensation for an inability to relax and feel safe within the self. I talk about this, that it's like all the emotions and all these things still don't necessarily feel safe, but you feel safe with that person, and thus safety is infused enough so to actually feel the feelings. And then, of course, the role of metaphor and storytelling in the mind to access these things. And it all sounds very beautiful on its own. And then as a preparation for psilocybin, which then sort of maybe radically expands that whole process.
Yeah.
It seems like really beautiful work that you're doing. And as you mentioned, your model, the guided meditation, of course, I'm thinking about the acceptance, connection, embody theory or model that you created, which I really want to ask you about. But I kind of want to step back a second and talk about a couple other things from sort of earlier on in the interview. But first, I'll give you a little bit of space to respond to what I just said there.
I mean, I just agree with all of it. With the that idea of safety, I was just thinking about the psychodynamic concept of containment, and how a baby emotional expression through being mirrored by its caregiver. So all the uncontained, petrifying. I mean, imagine the fear of a newborn baby, just not understanding anything about the world, being completely powerless, everything seeming huge, having all these funny physical sensations like pains and weird things going on, and having no clue about any of it. I mean, in a way, a psychedelic experience, it can be a bit like being a tiny little infant again, just in a world that you don't understand. And the role of the caregiver with the infant, the caregiver mirrors back to the child. The child is screaming, and when you look at the kind of caregiver's face, they kind of crunch up their face, and it shows the baby that it's safe to have these emotions, and look, I'm doing it too, but it's okay, I'm surviving it. So there is just something about that mirroring, that rather than trying to make people better or take them away from the anxiety, or even really kind of reassure them, although sometimes reassurance is important, that it's that being with someone and like sitting by their side and holding their hand, and almost like making noises. Like sometimes people will just make a particular noise, and you just kind of make some kind of noise that just kind of gives a signal of I'm here and I'm with you in this experience,
like this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And those kind of things are the things that give the that sense of, is it the ventral vagal system? It's that the peaceful, safe, calm, just allows everything just to drop, and for people to be with their experience. So yes, it's extremely important.
Yeah. Oh no, I gapped. It's something I was so inspired to say something, and it just like I went to say it and it just wasn't there. All right, so we're just gonna step back, and maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. So when you were initially describing the results of your 20 participants from the first study, and I do want to get into the ACE model afterwards. One of the pieces I wanted to talk about right at the beginning was people who aren't experiencing something. So then there are two other groups of people who did experience something, and some people had positive relief for a short period of time, depression came back. Others, positive relief for a long time, depression came back. Now, I kind of want to talk about the depression coming back say somewhat quickly compared to some
Yeah.
of the others. And I want to specifically point at something that when I listened to your breaking convention talk, it seemed like you made a concerted effort to inject this specific thing that is being said to your participants,
Hmm.
as if you're responding to a cultural misunderstanding. And maybe you want to talk about this, which is that you said, quote, "This is not just a brain reset. This is a
Yeah.
journey."
Yeah. Yes. That is so important. Um, because we say that now. There are so many differences between the cohort of the first study and the second. Um, One is that the first was treatment resistant depression in inverted commas, and the next one is major depression. But that's not the biggest difference. For me, the biggest difference is that the first group of people hadn't really heard very much about psilocybin, and they'd seen the study and they thought they'd come along, but they didn't really have that high expectations for it. But they just wanted to try something different. It sounded interesting, and they were really in a place where they were really desperate for something to help. The participants in the second study, the current study, there has been this media explosion in the 2 years intervening. And I did a qualitative analysis of the feedback of the first study, those 20 participants, and a couple of people mentioned this, the brain reset. So somebody said that it felt like his brain had been defragged,
Mm-hmm.
and that all the different parts were put in like different boxes, and it was all cleared out. The other person said he felt like his brain had been like short circuited, and then it had been working again. And somebody else said it was like a brain reset. So those were one of the sub themes of my thematic analysis, and that idea found its way into the media, and some of those quotes found their way into articles where the headlines would be, psilocybin resets the brain. And of course, so Robin Carhart-Harris's work and David Nutt's work with brain imaging, and Robin's amazing model, which is this rebus model, which is this model of how essentially this entropic brain state of increased connection, increased flexibility can loosen the grip of very, very entrenched beliefs afterwards. So in a way, that is a bit of a brain reset. So you can see how that data, which is still preliminary, it's still small numbers, but that model plus these quotes about the brain reset make this very compelling and almost very quite media sellable idea that
Mm-hmm.
psilocybin is the brain reset. And it's a great idea, and it would be lovely if that were just true, but of course it's not that simple. And that might work, that might be there for some people as part of the experience, that they feel the prison walls of depression have opened up and their brain feels like all the different parts communicate more easily and it's all a bit more fluid and flexible. It's wonderful. But to get there, they've been on this huge journey in the psilocybin experience itself, because the psilocybin experience doesn't feel like a brain reset of just like pushing a button. You're not lying on a couch with beautiful music and then a button is pressed in your head and everything gets reset. So I think that's what we really need to clarify now, that this amazing potential that we are seeing of some kind of changing of the landscape of the brain comes as part of a much broader therapeutic experience, which requires a lot of work. It's not a passive process. The brain is not just reset. There was some very, very interesting work also done which shows that the quality of the acute experience predicts outcome. So if you don't have you don't just get a reset without having any of the richness of the psychological experience, essentially.
Interesting. Well, that's I was just reading an article recently. Ben Sessa shared it on his Twitter, that they're trying to develop psychedelic drugs that treat stuff, but it seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding from this very pharmaceutical, physicalist brain creates consciousness perspective that that it's just a brain tissue issue, and doesn't recognize like the value of the experience as the medicine more so than the substance, which is really just the catalyst to the experience, or the catalyst that opens a capacity to have an experience contextually driven towards healing and resolution.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also feel that even if we could isolate the brain reset effect without the psychological journey beforehand, it would be such a loss. Because going through that kind of experience, going through that is with the right support, and the right help, be so empowering and important for people, because it gives them the message that when they have pain, they can deal with it, because they can sit with it, and they can be courageous, and they can call on support, and they can cry and weep and shake and go through all the stages and come down the other side, like you said. And it's how sad for us that we can't support each other to go through those processes. We have these emotions for a reason. These emotional processes are deep within us. And I think there's something about really just accepting the acceptance. But so there's this kind of two parts of the experience. There's the acceptance of difficult emotions and connection to joy and insight and other people and all these things. But I see them as two sides of the same coin, in that we can't just go for the positive parts of the experience and cut off the more challenging aspects, because we need both. Mm-hmm. The lessons that we learn, I think, requires to be open to both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking about, as you're saying this, I'm just wondering about like the future psychedelic pharmaceutical medicine, where it's just like we figured out a way to utilize the brain reset capacity without the experience, but you'll have to take it every day for the rest of your life.
Yeah, exactly. And it's how I feel a bit about microdosing, in that, I mean, I'm sure microdosing can be wonderful for people, but I also feel like I'd be very sad if microdosing became the dominant paradigm, because there's something about the macrodosing, about going into the shadow, about going into these painful places, that is so welcome and so needed by us, that if we just stay on the surface, then we're not changing the model, we're not changing the paradigm, we're sticking with this idea of wanting to just feel a little bit better and not going into the icky, horrible, gnarly, gross stuff at the very bottom. Mm-hmm. And if we don't go there, then it just stays there. So
yeah, I agree. And also I see there's a lot of value for myself, having gone to a lot of those icky places, the value of microdosing to just sort of relax a little bit and be able to be more attentive to feelings arising and feeling more encouraged to be with those feelings, even if they're gentle. I think while I was listening to your talk, I'm on a microdose today, don't tell anyone. I was listening to your talk, and you were describing the experiences of these participants. And maybe if I hadn't had the microdose, I wouldn't have had the response. But my response was to cry. I'm just crying in like grief and gratitude, because I get it, you know?
Yeah.
And maybe I would have been more in like the up too late funk of the day and not connected with that if I wasn't on the microdose. Maybe not. I don't know. But I think there is value there. But it really has a lot to do, I think, with the engagement, the perspective, the purpose, the meaning people put behind why they're microdosing and stuff. So completely agree with you, and also throwing in that little other bit.
And I would agree with that other bit as well. Yeah, for sure. I think there's a place for both of them, but just it would be sad if we lost the big deep dive.
Yes.
And just stayed on that. We need both, I think.
Yeah, probably. Agreed. Yeah, it's like that. I was talking with somebody not that long ago about like the bottom up and the top down, and maybe I'll use this as the segue into the final question I had about your first statements of the podcast before we move on, about the top down and the bottom up. And it's like the top down would be like how I conduct myself every day, like my sleep hygiene, my nutrition, my social engagement, my content consumption, my movement hygiene, all these things. I could get those like pretty straight, right? But if I'm not dealing with any of that deep stuff that's hanging around, then that will never really hold up to create a fundamentally healthy life. Possibly they'll overcompensate, and we lead to at some point I find myself in anorexia or something. But that's something else maybe for later. Or some other orthorexia, for example, like a obsession with making sure I'm always eating clean food all the time. But then if we just do the bottom up stuff, we just go in and do the deep journey and then come back up and we're still drinking alcohol, every weekend, going out partying with friends, hanging out with the same people, still staying up late playing video games and not sleeping properly. And then the bottom up work isn't really going to mean very much because it's not being carried
Yeah.
into the world. So, and I invite you to comment on this in addition to this next question, which is like, what do you think made the difference? Was there an integration issue for the people who only experienced a few weeks and the people who experienced 6 months of depression relief after the first trial?
Very, very interesting question. I think that study was an open label study looking at the safety of psilocybin. So the amount of integration support was basically very minimal. And people weren't really connected to integration communities. So I think some people, just trying to think, some people naturally made changes to their lives. Like one person I can think about got a really good new job and that made a huge change and that helped her to stay in a really good place. But yeah, it's very interesting. I think there were big life changes for many of the people that were able to stay well. And I also have to say that I think some of them went to do follow-up treatment as well. So I think the people that were in the group of people that stayed well for longer, they found ayahuasca ceremonies abroad and they went to do that. So I think I'm very, very supportive of the idea of, that you can't even say I'm supportive of the idea of integration. I can so see how integral integration is and how key it is. But I also think there's a slight hesitation in me because I feel like it's that whole idea of how much responsibility you put on people and the idea that someone just hasn't integrated enough. I do feel like people's psychedelic experiences are so different. What comes up with them is so different. For some, it'll be hours and hours of traumatic reliving. For some, it'll be unitive bliss and mystical insight. They have such different experiences and they come from such different places. For some people, it's so hard to make changes because of where they are living and those top-down things. They might be able to do some, but some of them are just beyond them. For example, I mean, I'm just making this up, but if you're a kind of carer for somebody that's very unwell or very dependent on you, that there are certain lifestyle choices you can change, but there are certain things that you have huge responsibilities and that might take quite I can see a therapeutic approach where somebody could be supported to really make those life changes, but it would take more than we were able to give people. So I guess what I'm trying to say is integration can really, it's sowing the seeds. You've got your little insights, your little pearls, and integration in the right environment. You can sow that. If you imagine the pearl is the seed, you can sow that seed, and with the right amount of soil and water and sunshine, it can grow. And it's wonderful when people are helped to do that. But often they don't have those conditions. And so it's hard for that seed to grow. And in that circumstance, I think it's not helpful for them if they feel that it was just that they didn't integrate it properly or that they somehow kind of failed, because our whole society is not yet inclusive enough of this kind of work to give people the communities and the structures and the whole approach that I think might be part of that soil and that watering and nourishment and sunshine. So in, I don't know, in South America, if you go and do a ceremony, then you might be going back into a community where that kind of learning and that way of being is the fabric of your life. And so it's understood and validated and prioritized and privileged and seen as important. In our culture, you might have this experience, you might want to go and integrate it, and then normal life, which is so different to this kind of thing, kind of sets back in, and the stigma of psychedelics sets back in, and the negative thoughts about psychedelics from everyone around you sets back in. And it would be natural in that circumstance to slightly question it, and maybe those insights feel like they disappear a bit, and you don't have a psychedelic community or a psychedelic aware community to support you. If you think about the model of AA, what's so powerful about that is your mentors, your group, this constant going into this way of doing things, this kind of surrender and believing in it and keeping going. And for psychedelic therapy, for the integration, I think so much of that needs a cultural group, peer support element, rather than expecting the individual to on their own make these huge changes. There's a certain amount that the individual can do. Some people are totally inspiring with the changes they bring in, but I think there is also a big chunk that is a kind of how our culture and society might make that difficult, and how that can change to make it more possible for people.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I'm really glad you laid it out that way, and I think you pointed to a lot of like issues in even the paradigm of thinking about personal growth and the sort of the prioritization and sort of ultimate responsibility of the self that fails to recognize how our sense of self and who we are as people is intricately intertwined with everyone around us presently, the social, not just the cultural, but the social civilizational institution in which our relationships are nested, which, just like those relationships, is a process that has been happening over time and is thus also connected to a history of things. So it's all well and good to have a positive psilocybin experience and to be better with like your feelings and feeling this. But if you're going back into a situation where the economics do not allow you to not work day in, day out at a job with somebody that treats you like shit, and possibly there's additional issues of, say, structural racism or ableism or whatever it might be, that the idea that you can then just become this healthy person now maybe totally removes a clear lens on how depression isn't just a person's past, it's also a person's present context that they're in right now, and the life that's sort of course grown by their choices, but choices that were made by others that put those people in situations that they really can't control. So I appreciate you sort of taking what could be, come even from what I had said, but also culturally in the psychedelic culture, this sort of implied blame for failing to be a better person after a psychedelic journey. I think that was a really important thing that you explained there.
Because I think when after a psychedelic experience, when people feel this kind of opening and they feel this kind of glow afterwards, and then when that fades after a while, which it seems to just fade kind of after however long, and the kind of closing up of the oyster shell again, they feel so sad about that loss. It's such a huge loss. It's like a grieving process. Like the participants from our previous study went through, and our current study, it's like a grieving process of, I've been depressed for years. I've tasted what it feels like to hear the birds sing, smell the fresh bread, enjoy the music, hold hands with my partner, like amazing opening and sensory aliveness. And then it all goes flatter again. The smells change, the intimacy changes, the joy starts to dissipate. And it's almost harder, having tasted it, to then lose it again. So I think, to make sure that we're really careful that we don't also add this other layer of like, oh well, you didn't you let yourself close down with it.
Like shaming the person.
They're already kind of struggling enough with the fact that these substances are impossible to access, apart from if you're one of a tiny number of people in the study. So it's already difficult enough for them when the effects start to kind of wear off.
Yeah, that's actually, I brought this up in my talk at the Psychedelic Society in London, and I continued talk that I'm doing a bunch of places about the sort of cultural, it's like the cultural theme right now, or cultural, like the quality of discourse around bad trips. Like there's no such thing as bad trips, only challenging experiences.
Mm.
And, the only reason you think it's a bad trip is because you resisted the experience, of which my previous work does, allude to. And I
Yeah.
accept responsibility for my misunderstanding in my previous, my previous stages of understanding.
Mm.
But that in doing so, it sort of says, like, oh, obviously you did it wrong,
Mm.
which is like a
Mm.
shaming, a blaming.
Yeah.
Like, no, you did, and also a total invalidation of a person's experience. No, that wasn't a bad trip. It was just really challenging. You only think it's a bad trip because you did it wrong. And it's
Yeah.
like, it's already a vulnerable enough thing to have. And then to be so invalidated and either explicitly or implicitly
Mm.
shamed for your
Mm.
inadequacy is just,
Mm.
it's really terrible. It's terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's true. Especially when someone's been through an experience like that. I mean, some experiences are truly horrifying.
Mm.
I mean, I still really believe they are opportunities for growth, but they can be absolutely shudderingly terrifying. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in the modern world, like you had said, things are so shit right now. Like things are crazy in the world. There's a lot of reason to numb out, and
Yeah.
I think that that there's a lot of people in the, I'm just gonna say it. I know there's a lot of baggage around the term, but in the privileged world,
Yeah.
of say England, yeah,
Mm.
or in Canada, or at least born and bred Canadian soil people who've lived in this society. We have a lot of immigrants here from war-torn places. But I think there's a misunderstanding of actually what terror means,
Mm.
and that some of these experiences are truly terrifying. And I'm not sure that that it's commonly understood these days of the people I've interacted with what terror really feels like and how intense it is. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And there is something about that, I think, that is so, I mean, it takes so much courage. It takes so much courage to do this.
Mm,
Really, it's a big, every time somebody chooses to dive deep like this, it takes so much courage. And I think, yeah, because people never know what they're opening themselves up to. It could be blissful, it could be really, really hard, and it could be really terrifying. And actually, yeah, it takes a lot of courage. And that courage, and that resilience, actually, of that, something about choosing to do something that could be really, really frightening for the purposes of good, of building, of learning, of growth. I think it's very, very commendable and a nice, a nice move. I think in a way that, like, there was a lot of discussion of mystical experiences and the joyful action the aspects, the connection aspects, and it's wonderful. But I also am getting more and more um, interested and kind of appreciative of the gnarlier aspects, just because I mean, quite yeah, there's something about, it's a very particular experience that calls on a very particular kind of courage and leads to a particular kind of growth and
mm-hmm.
strengthening and empathy for others.
Yeah.
Being broken open in that way, it's like it feels very important. It feels very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I
And
mean,
also kind of practice for perhaps difficult times ahead. I sometimes think that the kind of resilience building, or almost like practicing being in very, very difficult scenarios in psychedelic experiences, may be teaching us something about preparing for very, very challenging times fast approaching. It's
mm-hmm.
almost like preparing people for bad trips
Well,
that
just
are of
say
a
it.
real.
Preparing people for near-term social, ecological collapse,
Yeah.
thousands, millions of people dying,
Yeah.
further migrant crisis, total displacement of people, bodies in the
Yeah.
street, no food on the shelves, your neighbor breaking into your house. This is not,
Yeah.
at this point, it's not actually unreasonable to suspect that at some point in the next 20 years, maybe in the next 10 years, maybe in the next 5 years, there are going to be places which are otherwise safe and privileged countries experiencing this. So
Yeah.
and there doesn't seem to be any actual, pardon me, actual fucking effort being done by any of the larger institutions that have control over what's happening to at least some degree, to change course in any way. And so we're headed dead straight into that giant
Yeah.
bad trip.
Yeah. 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 So, practicing is maybe not a, maybe we should change the bad trip rather than saying it's just a challenging experience. It's like there's a value in a bad trip because we're practicing we're practicing what a bad trip feels like.
Yeah.
And how to survive it with compassion and composure and love. Because that's the other thing, that even in those challenging experiences / bad trips, there is so often, whether it's during the experience or afterwards, this opening to love and compassion. And that's going to be important.
I think there's something there about grief too. I'm noticing that when I'm speaking, there seems to be cutting out your audio, which is leading to some laggy stuff. So I'm going to be more mindful of that. I'm thinking about the value of grief, and I'll back reference again to Stephen Jenkinson about, he says something like, grief is joy and sorrow in equal measures. And he also says that that grief and love are sort of, what do you say, like cousins or something like that, or sisters, and that wherever you find one in any true measure, the other one's not far away, and that grief is a way of loving a thing that has left you, and love is a way of grieving that which has yet to leave. And I'm just reflecting on, of course, we have the value of love and connection and going through these things with connection, but also the deep value of being able, and psilocybin has really helped me. I mean, on some level, it's like, I want to say teach, but then teach often is interpreted with this sort of like cognitive intelligence framework. But I mean this in the sense of like, my relationship to the psilocybin experience has educated my nervous system. And as a response to that the lesson on how to be with difficult feelings, I've learned conceptually to allow and be present with grief as it arises. And the more that I understand like the impermanence of things, and the more I can recognize their value, and the more I value them, the more I love them, and then the more I love them, the greater the grief. And there's like this beautiful cycle. And that's definitely something that is, and wow, I'm kind of going off of my own thing here. I apologize about this, but I'm just going to finish. Okay, yeah.
I love
it. Is that, in psilocybin was a huge part of that, also learning outside of psilocybin, but ultimately, encouraged me to reassess my priorities in life. And the reassessment of my priorities led me towards ultimately doing that top-down, but also bottom-up changes as well, that has led to, I mean, for me, lesser tendency to fall into depressive states. And a greater tendency to be able to give myself compassion and have the social relationships needed to, like reach out and know when to reach out and move towards intimacy when those times arise. So I realize I just went on a spiel of my own thing there. So I'll kind of like wait for you to like bring us back here.
I love those quotes from Stephen Jenkins about grief and joy and sorrow and love. They remind me of some Khalil Gibran. I never know if I say his name, but a couple of the ones from him. So he says, "Your grief is your sorrow unmasked." No, your joy is your sorrow unmasked. It's the same idea. And the other one is, the deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the greater the joy you can contain. So it's the same idea, that they are the two sides of the same coin. They're the same thing. When you know what your joy is, your sorrow unmasked. When you understand your sorrow, you find your joy. Because when you understand why that loss or that pain hurts you so much, you know why it hurts you, because it contravenes some soul requirement of yours. So it's your navigational system towards what that longing is. So your joy is your sorrow unmasked. You find your joy through your sorrow.
Just thinking about understanding your sorrow and
Mm.
thinking about like breaking down the words of understanding. And there's one sense of like possibly an opportunity there for some spiritual bypassing. Oh, like
Mm.
my sorrow is actually my joy. I can just change it into
Mm.
joy or something.
Yeah.
But to understand your sorrow, to understand, so to
Yeah.
allow it to like to be in it completely, to allow it to
Yeah.
envelop you.
Mm.
I mean, in a healthy way. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, we can. Depression in many ways feels like being cast over by
Mm.
pain and things. But there's a different quality to what I'm talking about here.
Yeah. Yes. No, I know exactly what you're getting at. And yes, when you think about the word understand, I was talking to someone about this the other day. Like, what does understand mean? We say understand so lightly, like, oh yeah, I understand. Understand means to like you're under that, you're letting something stand on you. You're underneath this thing that is standing on you. Like it's difficult to describe it. I just feel it almost in my body, this sense of understanding. I am under um I'm the foundation, I'm the floor of that.
Hmm.
That is standing on me and I'm under it. It's that complete um solidity of, yeah, like you said, letting it kind of take you over. It's you're full of it. Um and that's what psychedelics can help you do, like understanding rather than just, yeah, thinking
Hmm.
about something.
Yeah, I'm thinking about being like fully immersed in the gravity of the thing.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
And yeah, it feels like a really embodied thing. Like when you say, like, I think I first thought about this when it's actually the first psychedelic conference I ever went to. It was called Plant Consciousness. It was years ago, and I was at the back of the room, and this amazing woman just asked me some question, and she said, "Do you understand?" And I said, "Oh yeah, yeah." She said, "No. Do you understand?" It was something to do with the topic of the lecture. And I said, "Yeah, I think I do." She said, "No, what I mean is, like, are you under that idea? Are you under that idea that is standing on you? Are you holding that idea? Do you understand it? Do you stand, like, you underneath it?" And then I got what she meant in a feeling in my body. And I, like, really
Hmm.
thought about it, like, do I understand it? And I, like, felt the feeling. And I realized I didn't. Like, I had some cognitive awareness, but I wasn't embodying that idea. So I do think that's what psychedelics can help us do. And so the idea of understanding our sorrow, the sorrow is plonked on us and in us and through us, and we feel it in our hearts, in our bodies, and it's horrible. It's such a horrible experience, like, to be so overtaken. It's not comfortable in any way, but that the fullness of that understanding changes you, I think, in some way almost forever, because once you've fully understood it, and it then you can never like you can never lose that understanding. And
Hmm.
I think, yeah, it's
I think
important.
one of the thing, I don't know how common this is. I'm not sure how many people I've spoken to about it, but one of the things I it's at this point, psilocybin and the psilocybin experience is so intertwined with my life and my identity and my sense of self that it's kind of impossible for me to differentiate what I learned from my psilocybin experiences and what I learned outside, because I think the very way that I conduct myself as a person is so deeply informed by those experiences. Um, which is that at some point in my life, I began to see like moments of like really understanding sorrow,
Mm.
as moments I was really grateful for. And I don't know, I don't want this to sound like I don't feel like I'm saying like, oh, I'm like really good at like suffering. I'm like happy that I'm suffering. No, no, no. But I mean, like, there'll be moments, especially in psilocybin, where there is deep grief, deep sorrow. And at some point in there, all of a sudden, there's this gratitude. And I'm just so thankful. But I'm not thankful like this feels good. I'm still crying and it still hurts. And it's also like,
Mm.
thank you so much for letting me feel this. And I think that's where sort of the grief, sorrow, joy, gratitude,
Yeah.
love blend starts to emerge, and these rich, blended, complex emotions sort of move through my body.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The gratitude is I think often the gratitude is almost like the turning point from like exploring the oyster and the gnarly slime and finding the pearl. It's often gratitude that turns the experience from one of kind of suffering into one of connection and often joy, because whatever you've gone through, when there is understanding and insight, but also gratitude, for surviving it, like you've
Mm.
got through it. But,
Mm-hmm.
oh, phew, so grateful for all the little things when you've been through something like that. But also, yeah, gratitude for the insight about it, and gratitude for people in your life. Forgiveness as well. Gratitude can come from forgiveness, because when you understand things and you see that people's intentions weren't perhaps as bad as you thought, there's that level of forgiveness that can lead to such an opening of gratitude and love and thanks, and that, yeah, can.
And forgiving the self too.
Yeah.
There's been lots of times where I've recognized that, through, I don't like the idea of fault and blame. Of course, everyone's always responsible for their decisions, but to place blame and fault in these really clear cut ways comes from, I think, like a fundamental misunderstanding of the actual complex nature of human interaction with like society and time and whatever. But there'll be lots of moments where I realize like, I am the reason I've been suffering. And then there'll be moments of me just like acknowledging that, having compassion for why I did that, but also like apologizing to myself and forgiving myself. And yeah.
Yeah. So important to do. It's so hard. So hard. I mean, that's the thing that we probably see the most in the depression study, is that the kind of the most prevalent force, like the way depression seems to be embodied or manifest like in the room, is very punishing self attack, and it's probably something that all of us have to a certain degree, can identify that. But it's so devastating and heartbreaking, because people would never speak to somebody else the way they speak to themselves. If you could, all of our inner voices, our inner critical voices, like if we could hear them, we'd be shocked by the way we speak to ourselves, and we would never speak to others that way.
Consciously, anyways, or in conscious control of ourselves.
Yeah. Well, maybe occasionally we would, but we would never want to express that to another person, because we would know the impact it would have on them. It would be very painful for them. Yeah.
So this So this is, sorry, again, the laggy, I apologize. So this kind of directs us further into a better understanding of accept, connect, embody, which we've been talking around this whole time. And I'm still not going to get you to explain it yet, because I have another question.
Okay.
But soon. Now, you talked about your metaphor that you take people on this guided journey in their mind. I'm curious about so now we're in the psilocybin session. How directive is it? This is the question. How directive is the psilocybin experience, or the therapy session? Sorry.
So completely non. In the preparation session the day before, we do the guided visualization, the journey, and that is about going into the oysters and working out what the current negative emotions are for somebody. So they might, for example, find oysters that represent fear, shame, and anger, for example. And they go into each one and they explore it, and then they search for the pearls in each one. And then the pearls that they find, they use to set an intention for the next day. It enriches their understanding of where they are emotionally at that time. So they'll have an intention they've already set about what they want there to be more of in their life after the psilocybin sessions. And then we supplement that with this more emotional work from the visualization. So this journey of diving down into the waters is done the day before. and it's to help us learn about their inner world, their inner emotional experience. And the purpose of it is really to, it's a kind of practice session for how about going into difficult emotions towards them rather than away. It also helps the participant and the therapist build trust and work out how to communicate with each other, because when they've got the headphones and the eye shades on, it can be quite difficult to communicate. So it's practicing that, because it's an interactive exercise. So they dive down, they open the oysters, and they tell you what they're finding, and you're having this conversation as they're going through this emotional experience and they're feeling anger. They're telling you about it, and then they tell you what the pearl is. So it's about trust building, communication, refining, and preparing them in an embodied way for this idea that tomorrow, when they have the psilocybin, if difficult things come up, go right into them and look for the pearl. So that's the purpose of it. On the day of the psilocybin experience itself, there's nothing directive. So they come in, they have their coffee. If they have coffee, they do a few questionnaires. They come into the room, the playlist goes on. We ask them if there's anything that they want to talk about, but usually they don't. They want to get straight to it. They might say their intentions again. The psilocybin goes into their bowl. They hold the bowl. They take the psilocybin capsules. They lie back. We might chat for a little while about something. If they're feeling anxious, we might just chat about something to ease the pressure, ease the sense of kind of tension. They might look at a few pictures in a book of paintings. And then eye shades and headphones go on, and they have their experience, and there's nothing to do with the metaphor in the whole day. Although actually, interestingly, the idea of diving down does quite commonly feature in people's experiences. So there is it is getting in there somehow.
Yeah, this is a priming. Yeah.
There is a priming effect. Yeah. But there's no direction on the day at all.
So then this, I personally think that this is a complicated question. And I think it's complicated less because of how I would answer it if I was asked, but more because of what it asks people to consider insofar as their perspective on the nature of reality and the self. But what is it? What is your understanding of why it is that psilocybin is able to bring up, like it seems to organically draw people to, of course, with an understanding of the importance of context setting and, safe interaction, like the whole therapeutic thing, the priming, so on and so forth. What is it about psilocybin that seems to guide people or allow people to just organically access what needs to be seen and understood and felt, processed and resolved in order to get the positive clinical outcomes that people end up having? What is your understanding of what psilocybin is doing and why it does that?
My understanding is that most of the time people are operating in their normal state of consciousness, which is dominated by the default mode network, the ego talk, the constant chitter-chatter of the mind, which can be anything from to-do list, to do this, got to do that, why haven't I done that? Benign chitter-chatter, whatever, to very punishing, self-attack, anxious thoughts, negative thoughts, ruminating about things that have happened over and over again to try and somehow solve problems, but they just keep repeating. And that people are in, so to use the kind of ACE model, the analogy, that's like being on the surface of the sea, and people are swimming against these waves all the time. So you're swimming against the waves of the stuff you've got to do that day, and also what your mind is telling you about keeping safe. So you're swimming against these constant waves. And what psilocybin helps people do is it helps people dive down below the surface. And it's in that diving down that all the stuff that needs to be processed is kind of lying there on the seabed. It's been pushed down because it hasn't been able to be processed because we've been operating on the surface level. So I suppose the brain way of saying it is that it, by deactivating the default mode network's grip, it enables other information to surface. Or thinking about it in the terms of the rebus model, that when those very, very entrenched, strong beliefs, set rigid beliefs with this gravitational pull that just dominate that person's experience of themselves, they can be relaxed. It can just allow other material. So it's just allowing other material in that doesn't normally get to be processed. That's the kind of brain way of seeing it. But for me, I very much see it in this terms of like the levels of experience and how, oh, can you hear me still?
Yep.
How it allows you to dive down below that level of mental chit chat that is very difficult to dive down from otherwise. And that's why I think that other things can have the same effect. So breath work, meditation, vision quests, being in darkness for a very long period of time, people can have the same kind of experiences because you're diving from that surface level of just swimming against the waves down to the depths of what's there. And what's there are things that haven't been fully resolved yet, and so they're still there, like kind of debris. But we need to open the oyster cell, see what's there, to process it in order for it to be kind of cleared away. And sometimes it takes a lot of experiences. Like, you're not going to clear away it all in one go, but repeated going through that. So the idea that you were saying before about the stages of grief and going through all those different stages of crying, getting to the keening, and the idea of Bessel van der Kolk's work about, the trauma being kept in the body. And if you don't get to express it, it just stays there. So you have to have the full expression. Mm-hmm. So I see it that when you dive down below that surface level, you can, the most pressing trapped things that need to be worked through in order for you to feel a sense of relief will come up first. So that's the idea, Stan Groff's idea of the homeostatic mechanism at play, that the body will balance itself somehow, so that the issues that are causing the most imbalance, the things that are the most trapped, those are the ones that we will access initially.
So then are we, okay, I don't mean to try to fish for an answer here. And if it seems like I am, I want you to call me out on it. Okay.
Yeah, I will.
I'm just wondering about, so you use the metaphor to explain it, which is good, but then the map is never really the terrain. And so when this is happening, what is it that seems to, is there a natural healing intelligence to the body? Is there a natural healing intelligence that's present in the molecule? Is there a natural healing phenomenon that emerges in the combination of the two? I'm just curious about how it is that these most relevant things seem to come up, and in the right context seem to be experienced in a way very specific memories, very specific imagery, very specific everything, exactly what's needed to have it be personally meaningful, impacting, understood, and comprehended for a healing process to unfold.
Yeah, it's a very important and very, very good question. I think about it a lot, and I really don't know. I really don't. The idea of an innate healing intelligence in the molecule, or people will talk about it as being in the mushroom. I couldn't say no. I couldn't completely dispute that and disprove that. I just don't know. I guess, I suppose what psychedelic exploration does do is it shows you how little we understand in some ways, that there is these vast other worlds and this vast symbolism, and which can be very difficult to decode sometimes. Just reminds me of how we are operating in this one level of experience a lot of the time, and there is so much that we don't understand. So I really don't know. I mean, in terms of an innate healing intelligence in the body, that one's a bit easier to kind of answer, in the sense that, yes, I think so. The way the body, if you cut yourself, the wound will turn into a scab. It'll naturally heal itself. You don't have to think about it. All the things that need to go to that area will go there naturally. The body does naturally balance itself and go to the places of blockage and try and unblock them. So in conditions of health, it does anyway. So I think that, I feel that there is a homeostatic healing intelligence in the body. Um, and as for the molecule, I just don't know. I mean, I kind of love it when people talk about, like, asking the mushrooms and the mushrooms talking to them. And it's not something I've ever experienced myself, but I think it's when people talk about it, it makes me feel happy, because I would love it if that were to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
I would love it if nature, we are part of the web of nature, and I would love it if some parts of this amazing web were 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 coming to our aid at this time when we need it. I would love it for that to be the case, but we certainly don't see in our studies. We certainly don't see people. Well, it's not quite true. Sometimes people feel that they're getting that. Often people feel like they're getting messages from spirit guides, but not so much the mushroom speaking to them directly.
Mm.
Yeah.
Cool. I mean, all of that might just be like a model for an interpretive model for understanding an entirely bizarre and very different experience, right? We have all these coherent models for waking state, right? So
Yeah.
interesting. So let's this has been a great conversation, and we're pretty deep, and I feel like I've been alluding to it this whole time that I was going to ask you about it. And so maybe the last series of questions we go through here can focus on your accept, connect, embody model that you've developed with your team, as far as I understand. And maybe as you're explaining it, you'll likely, there's lots of content that we've already talked about that you could back reference, but maybe couch it in also a description of why it is that in particular seems to be positive for resolving or healing depression, which might ask you to explain a little bit about where depression comes from as well.
Mm-hmm. So the accept, connect, embody model is a framework it's a metaphor, essentially, for understanding, or a framework for viewing the psilocybin experience. Well, actually, no, it's a framework for emotional voyaging for the purposes of finding meaning. So it doesn't have to be used with psychedelics. You can do it without. And the model is really it's built around a diagram, and the diagram is a oval shape, and the bottom half of the oval is blue, and the top half is pink, and the bottom half says accept on it, and the top half says connect. And the dividing line between the blue and the pink is seen as the surface of the sea. So the blue is the sea and the pink is the sky. And this diagram is the basis of a visualization exercise where you take people in stages. So there's 6 stages, and the first stage is at that dividing line between the blue and the pink halves, and that's the level of the waves, the surface, that day-to-day chit-chat of the ego mind. And at that stage, the instruction is let go. So let go of the ego mind, let go of concerns, and just drop down into your body. The second stage is going down into the water, and that's the body. And that's about feeling different sensations in your body, doing a body scan, getting awareness of where there might be tightnesses or like sense of aches or funny feelings. And that helps people get into their emotions. The third stage is at the very bottom of the sea, when they've got dive down to the bottom, and they're looking around, and they find these piles of oyster shells, and these oyster shells represent painful feelings. And so they go into those oyster shells, they go into those feelings, and they are encouraged to open them up, go through them, and search around in the gunky innards. So there's this idea that in our painful experiences, there's this kind of hard shell of don't go here, maybe anger, rage, sometimes just kind of sadness about it. But underneath those layers, there can be very tender, vulnerable feelings of being exposed, of shame, of feeling very unsafe. So they go through that layer of the hard shell and the spikes, and then through the gunk and the slime, and they're encouraged to search for the meaning of that experience, and they look for a pearl. And the pearl is the meaning because of what they've learned through going through these difficult going through the oyster shell. And then when they find a pearl, the next instruction is to swim up. So this is about swimming up through the water, and it's bursting through the surface of the sea. And this is a sun. So the next stage is the sun, and the sun is the self, the self with a big S, not the little s. It's the big self. And this is the self of you've been in all these emotions, then you burst through the surface, and you're able to see everything. You have this perspective. You've felt this. You've learnt this lesson, and then you're connected to yourself in a deeper way because of what you've been through, and you have a new perspective on everything. So you connect to yourself, and then the next stage is to look in your hand and you see this pearl. And this is about values. This is about meaning of what that teaches you, the lesson. And then the final stage is about setting intentions for how you will actually turn this value or this lesson into actual behavioral change. So this is about the bigger vista. This is like the whole, like how this is going to fit into your whole life. And this is about what you were saying about the kind of, it's very much top down, bottom up, because of the model, the pink and the blue half is very much the bottom up feeling of emotions, and the top half is the kind of top down behavioral change aspect. Another way of seeing it is the blue bit is all about pain, and the pink bit is more about kind of meaning or joy, and connection. So it's difficult to explain without the diagram, but the diagram is based, those 6 principles map onto the 6 aspects of psychological flexibility as described by something called the hexaflex. And the hexaflex is a model of psychological flexibility that's been described in a type of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. And these 6 processes map onto those 6 processes in the diagram. So essentially what you have is you have a model of psychological flexibility. Each one of those stages, the letting go, the being aware of your body in the moment, the acceptance of emotions, the connecting to your larger observer self, connecting to your values, and connecting to how to actually like act upon those values. Those 6 stages are the 6 processes of psychological flexibility. So it's transposing that psychological flexibility model onto the different stages of a psychedelic adventure. And so essentially what the model is trying to do is trying to support it in psychological flexibility. It's helping people stay open after the experience as well, because it's helping people have a model for how they can, in the days and weeks and months and years after the psychedelic experience, continue to do this, to continue diving into their emotions, feeling them, and connecting to meaning and values all the time. So a simplified version of the diagram is just one that just says, it's like a circle with a pink half and a blue half, and it just says accept and connect. And I use that all the time, the very simple models for myself, just because in pretty much any given situation, you can think about what do I do here? And you think, well, accept the difficulty and connect to the meaning. And it's a very simple formulation, but it's quite effective. So, so the way we use it in the study is that journey is the basis of 2 visualization exercises. The first is a preparation one. So people go on the dive and they go into the oysters of how they're feeling, and then they connect to the pearls, and that helps inform an intention for the next day. And the other version of it is slightly different, and that's for integrating the experience. So they do that the day after. And we make an audio recording of that for them to take home so that they can keep doing the visualization at home. And all these materials, the visualizations, the diagram it's going to be published, so that'll just be available to anyone that wants to use it. And I guess, thinking about why it might be helpful for people with depression. So there is, from the work done by proponents of acceptance and commitment therapy, so Steve Hayes is the originator of this type of therapy. And there are loads of parallels, by the way, between acceptance and commitment therapy and psychedelic work. The models fit together very, very naturally.
I've heard that from several people, actually.
Yeah. And there's going to be a special issue in the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science soon, a special psychedelic issue. So I expect this synergy will become more and more celebrated soon. There's a lot we can learn. Both sides can learn a lot from the other side in this way. Like ACT can learn a lot from psychedelics can learn a lot from ACT, I think. So what was I saying?
Depression.
There's going to be a special issue. Yes, so with depression, so the work of people like Steve Hayes focuses a lot on this thing called experiential avoidance. So experiential avoidance is essentially avoiding your difficult feelings, not consciously, but it's just a natural process that happens. And in a way, it ties in with what we were talking about before about not having a psychedelic experience, because it may be that it's the extreme of experiential avoidance kicking in. And it's not a conscious thing, that people don't choose to avoid their experiences, but it happens. So, for example, rumination is something very commonly reported by people with depression. And rumination is basically the mind going over and over and over and over something, kind of trying to solve it, but just going over it. And when people are ruminating, they're so in their heads, they're totally disconnected from their feelings. So something bad might happen. You have an embarrassing thing that happened at a party. You felt shame. And what happens is that you go away and you ruminate for hours. You're stuck in your head going over and over and over and over. And you're not fully engaging with the complex package of emotions that go with that. Whereas if you were to really stay with your feelings, to drop into your body, you might experience shame and then rage and then desolation. You know, you might go through those things and afterwards feel much better because you'd worked through it. But by ruminating, you never really get there. So that's one kind of experiential avoidance. You're avoiding the emotional experience. Another type is distracting yourself or numbing out, you know, consciously. So experiential avoidance seems to be this transdiagnostic phenomenon that is linked to lots of different mental health problems. But the way it seems to manifest in depression is often this kind of rumination. So although people think depression is all about being sad, it's actually often about being numb. People often report very flattened emotional repertoires rather than they're stuck in a very flat way of being. So that idea of diving down into those emotions is undoing experiential avoidance. It's giving people an opportunity to do something different and to really accept those experiences. It's the opposite of experiential avoidance. It's this acceptance. And this whole model is based around the qualitative research that I did on the first study, which found that there were these two very prominent themes that people described when they talked about what psilocybin had done for them. They described that depression was disconnection, and that psilocybin helped them connect to themselves, others, and the world around them, and that depression was also about avoidance of emotion. So experiential avoidance, in other words, and that psilocybin helped them accept. So it's disconnection to connection, avoidance to acceptance. And so so these two processes of accept and connect came from the participants. It was what they said happened. So the way the model was developed was me taking the two concepts of acceptance and connection as the mechanisms of psilocybin innately and turning them into something a bit richer and a bit more usable, and to give people tools to help them with that process. So I don't know, does that kind of describe it?
Yes, actually, but there are two things that came up there. One of which, and I feel like we're at like almost 2 hours, and I feel my cognitive fatigue coming on because we've been deep for 2 hours, and even the listeners might be like, listeners get to take a pause and come back to this later. Yeah, we're almost through.
Just having some coffee.
please. So the first thing is that I think I understand, but I didn't hear you explain where the embody comes in, because you talked a lot about the acceptance and the commitment, acceptance and the connection. How about embody?
Yes. So the embodiment aspect runs through the whole thing. The embodiment is the way that those mechanisms unfold. Acceptance is an embodied process of feeling the emotions in your body. So when you go to those oyster shells and you dig around, you feel it in your body. So whenever we do this with people, we're operating on two different levels. There's the kind of visual metaphor level of this water and the oysters and that, but then there's the body level. And what's happening is they go through each stage, their body is changing. And the first stage is about diving down from the mind into the body. The second stage is this body scan of creating awareness of how the body is feeling. And the third stage is going to the emotions, and it's very much felt in the body. So we encourage that through just questions like, where do you feel it in your body? So in the preparation, where do you feel it in your body? And then in the session itself, people will often report, rather than saying I'm feeling very sad or I'm feeling very happy, they will say I've got a tight feeling in my chest.
Be careful with hitting your mic.
Oh,
Yeah.
like a tight feeling in my chest, or a funny feeling in my stomach, or something like that. And that's the way in. So it comes through the body. And then the connection, perhaps less so there. I mean, that can be maybe perhaps sometimes more happening on a kind of cognitive level, this idea of connecting to meaning and values. But I think really the embodiment aspect is really, it envelops the whole thing. And I guess it's so relevant as well because we're understanding more and more about things like polyvagal theory, and more about the way our whole system can respond or not respond to psychedelics, and how working with the body is such a good way to help the experience flow, often for people if they feel a bit stuck. So it feels like accept, connect, and embody are the three things we need to do. They're the three things we need to help people. They're the three reminders that we can give people to get the most out of the psilocybin experience. It's the three things we can remind people to do in their waking life to help them engage with life. And it's also, they're the kind of opposites of the things that are linked to depression so often. So if I think about depression, it's experiential avoidance rather than acceptance. It's about being disconnected from values and meaning and other people and yourself and the world. Mm-hmm. And it's often about a disembodiment of living in your head. Our culture is very, very much focused on the head, and we don't have a language for the body and how the body works. And we're getting better at it, I think. Like if you look at how yoga has become so much more popular now, but we're not a very embodied culture. So acceptance, connection, and embodiment are at the simplest level of the body. It's like a reminder of three things that you can do in any moment to help you engage with life. It's not three things that will take away your sadness or take away your pain or make you feel better. It's about how to engage with it and live. Depression is, in a way, I guess the evolutionary purpose of depression is when like the person or the animal or is feeling not to their best, if they're feeling depleted, it's like taking them to the back of the cave so that they're not engaging in interactions. So depression, the evolutionary purpose of having depression is like saying, okay, so you're not firing on all cylinders, so self-isolate, go into a dark place and stay away so that you're not engaging with the world. And that does make sense, that there are times when it's better for us to take time and stay quiet and take stock and heal and get stronger. But with depression, it's when that state stays for a long time. Mm-hmm. And in that state, it can feel for people like they are just trapped in that cave. They're trapped in that dark place. And so the opposite of depression isn't happiness. It's kind of it's being able to engage with the world again. And so in a way, a psychedelic experience is often people are kind of coming into it from the place of being in a very trapped place and often living quite restricted lives into this rich engagement with things that they haven't experienced before. And so I suppose what we're doing with our framework is we're encouraging people to do the incredibly courageous act of, even though they feel bad and even though it feels totally impossible and overwhelming, to come out of that dark place and engage with things. And even though everything's stacked up against them doing it, is to encourage them that they can, because these processes can help them. The acceptance, the connection, the embodiment, like welcoming the pain and going through it, choosing to do it with the support that they require, with a kind of, if you see it as no matter how painful it is, it's like it's important, it's important, and and they're not alone in doing it. So I guess that's the model. It's a kind of map for helping people engage with all the difficulty and bad things that can happen in life, by accepting, connecting, and embodying.
Cool. Thanks. Let's take a little breather, because this next question, I think this next question might be really easy for you, but if I was asked it, it would be a difficult one.
Okay.
Have a little stretch here. Sip of coffee.
I can't wait to hear what the question's going to be.
Oh yeah, you're probably like, oh yeah, that question. That's fine. 20 seconds. So you mentioned this right at the beginning when you were mentioning the model, and also you have mentioned it many other places, and it's actually very common for people mention it. And when it's said, it seems to make intuitive sense. Actually, pardon me, I gotta take a drink here. It seems to make very intuitive sense. Most people understand what you mean when you say this, but I want to know what you mean. So you say there's a value, or you allude to there being a value and it being necessary for people to find meaning. But this is like two sort of simultaneous questions, which is like, well, what is meaning? And is it something that you find? Or is it something that you make? Or is it some combination?
No, I've never been asked that question before. I guess. So meaning is what turns the pain into the grief, into the love, I guess. That without the meaning, the pain is pointless. So just an experience of discomfort and ickiness is very overwhelming and difficult to deal with. And then meaning comes through, and it's whether I don't know whether people find it or whether it is something that those kind of insights in psychedelic sessions seem to just kind of come to people. Like something will be shown, or something happens in the meaning, the light bulb turns on, or things clarify. I don't know if they can necessarily find it, but it's about being open to it and about going towards the thing. So if you lean right into that difficult feeling and you go deeper with it and go deeper and deeper, you keep tunneling, keep going down, keep saying yes to it. Yes, yes, yes. Then you'll give yourself the opportunity to work through it, to process the feelings, to let those trapped feelings be worked through, which can lead to a sense of kind of catharsis and release. And that might be the meaning. Or you just stay with it long enough to get an insight about it, about what it meant, maybe to feel the forgiveness, maybe to feel some compassion, maybe to see it in a new way. But to get there, you've got to stay with it. So the idea about finding meaning is stay with your pain long enough for it to turn into just black, horrible, dark, gungy, into the light at the end of the tunnel, perhaps, or just understanding why you're there in that place.
So this is so I'm sorry to stop you as your because I'm hearing you describe something and then calling it something else. Is that you are talking about finding the meaning, but then you're describing a very specific process of engagement, almost like an alchemical process that is on a cognitive level. It's on an experiential sort of we'll say metaphorical thought level. It's on a feeling based somatic level, and you're going through this very intentionally, and the consequence of it is meaning. And you're saying that you find the meaning, but it sounds like a pretty creative engagement that's coming out of there. So I'm wondering about is this is what I'm pointing at. Is it a finding or is it a making? And does differentiating the two, or even just like creating some sort of understanding of the differences, of the potentials of the difference, does it change
Mm.
anything?
Mm. I think it's both. Sometimes it feels like the meaning is there. The meaning comes through the insight, the sudden clarity. You're shown an image about this, and then you're showing about this, and you're shown this, and then there's an answer. And the meaning is the sequence of events that you're shown, like it's shown to you. Sometimes it's made. Sometimes it's made through staying with it, through engaging with it, and this creative process you describe. So I think it can be both. Um, and I wonder how much it changes the experience, I guess. For some people, the idea of making meaning might take away some of the kind of magic of the psychedelic experience, the idea that you're making your own story, you're writing your own story. But I don't actually see that. I see that as quite empowering in that psychedelics, they're non-specific amplifiers. They can induce this very creative, connected state where, and people are quite suggestible in that state too. So I do feel like that often there is this kind of meaning-making process between the setting, the guides, what's happened on the preparation day. The very fact that people often have these watery images coming in because of the visualization shows that meaning is being made as a creative process. So I do think maybe more often it is a meaning-making process, and just as valuable for being something that's created rather than being something that's given from on high. Mm-hmm. But I definitely have seen those kind of, I've seen people describe those moments of just like downloads or sudden inspiration, sudden clarity, where it feels like they're being given answers by something else. Mm-hmm. And that feels more like they found the meaning, or they've stumbled upon the meaning, or the meaning has been shown to them.
See, even then, I'm feeling like I can't remember what it was earlier that you talked about something being, essentially the same, different sides of it, and yeah, I'm thinking about that it's like, so the finding and the making is kind of, it's the exact same. It just depends on the angle of approach. Like it's still an elephant. Think about like the blind people, a bunch of blind people touching an elephant. Because even when it's discovered, I mean, wow, I found all this meaning. Well, how did you find it? Well, you found it by setting an intention and being in a group. And and I'm thinking about these ideas now with you, right? And I'm thinking about my experiences with contact improv, which is contact improvisation is a type of dance, right? And if I were to say, like, there are certain moments where I feel like, wow, new pathways of movement open up, new moments of connection. I'll just say, like, the dance really comes alive. Yeah. And then it's like, whoa, there's the dance that's coming alive. And if I were to say that if I were to make the dance coming alive as sort of a metaphor for the meaning, it was a discovery, like, whoa, here we are. The dance is alive. Here's this meaning. It just came. But also, both people dancing were putting forth effort into responding to the other, like, and on top of that, each of them have their own skill sets, and each of them have their own, there's all these variables that aren't necessarily in control. I'm not in control of the other person. I'm not necessarily in control of how my body is feeling or what it's capable of today. All these different things that are totally variables outside of my control, but I'm engaging all these things that are in and out of my control. And that's a conscious creative, in this thing, co-creative act. And maybe with the psilocybin, it's a co-creative act.
It's like unconsciously co-created, perhaps, in a way. I don't know, but yeah,
just to some level. I don't want to make the metaphor.
Or
basically, it's like, it feels like finding, but it was all very creative, a making thing. But it wasn't, I am making this. Yeah. It's like, I am in relationship with something, and that relationship is making a thing that I am now discovering.
Yeah. Yes, I'm totally with that. That completely resonates with me. Yeah, completely. That really feels like it describes the process. Yeah, so much.
Cool. Well, let's find the close here. What's the close? All right. So you have a thing coming out. The model that you talked about is coming out. It's being published. So I guess there's three, possibly four questions, which might be easy. One, how do people find out more about what you're doing / follow you on social media, which might include when they might be able to read this this model
Yeah.
that you have coming out. Two is, how do people is there possibilities for people to apply to be a part of the ongoing depression trials?
Yeah.
I don't know what 3 or 4 are yet, though, so we'll just start there.
Okay, great. Yeah. So so the ACE Accept, Connect, Embody model will be published in the upcoming special issue, psychedelic special issue of the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science. I'm not sure when that's going to be out, but I will put that on. I mean, I'm really bad at Twitter. I basically never go on it. I don't even know my Twitter name. I think it's Ros.Watts.
I'll find out and put it on.
Find
I'll
out.
find out for you. Yeah.
And I am at some point going to have a website where I can put resources out there for people. I haven't got it yet, but I will at some point get around to doing that. But we're also thinking about putting some of the exercises from the ACE model onto our psychedelic survey, so that when people do the psychedelic survey pre and post experience, they can engage with some of this work, and we can then empirically test if it's improving outcomes.
So this is psychedelicsurvey.com. Is that correct?
Yeah, psychedelicsurvey.com. Yeah. So that's something for the future to look out for, so that we can see whether, if people engage in the visualizations, whether they have better therapeutic, if their well-being increases are bigger, that kind of thing. And then, yeah, so that's the ACE model. There was something else you said.
Oh, can people, how / if, yeah.
Yes. So we have a very, very long waiting list, but we are still recruiting, because our inclusion criteria are quite specific. So just because the waiting list is very long doesn't mean that we screen a lot of people on an ongoing way. So I can give you actually, I don't think I really want to give out. I'm not just thinking whether I want to give out the address. I think the best thing to do is to go to the Imperial website, because I think it gives details there. Mm-hmm. Just because otherwise, if I give Ashley's email address, she gets completely inundated with emails. Yeah. So I think the best thing to do is to go to the Imperial College Centre for Psychedelic Research website, which I don't actually even know what the website is.
I'll find that link out for you too.
And there they can, thank you, James. They can they'll find the contact details, because that means it's just a bit harder for people. So it might just mean that it's not harder for people. That sounds awful, but it's a bit more of a, people that are very serious about it will find out and apply, as opposed to we just get so many people emailing, and actually it just makes Ashley's job quite, I mean, she can never get around to her other jobs, like following up with the patient. So yeah, I think it's better to do it that way. Mm-hmm. We also only have probably, I guess, about 10 places left. So probably the likelihood of people actually getting through to the study is pretty low. So I don't know whether it's better to say. I don't know what the right thing to say is.
Well, it can't hurt for people to go onto the website and at the very least take a look around at the Imperial College Psychedelic Research Center website.
And I think if we say that the study's the recruitment is nearly closed, but there are still some spaces, but that would be how they would apply. But there are not so many places left now. Mm-hmm. Was there something else as well?
No, I didn't know if there was something else. I always just try to leave something open. Maybe something came, but I think that's it. We got, we'll find out through your Twitter when these new studies come out. Psychedelicsurvey.com, great resources there for people, and the Imperial College Psychedelic Research Center website to learn more about what the center is doing and achieving, as well as to possibly get involved with the depression trials.
Yes, sounds good.
Great. Well, Dr. Rosalind Watts, thank you very much for being on Adventures Through the Mind.
Thank you so much for having me.
And cut. Okay, that ends this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. If you liked it, share it. The new ATTMind podcast clips channel on YouTube is going to have a bunch of clips coming out over the next few days for easy sharing of specific pieces. If you heard a part that later you're like, oh, you didn't clip this part out, or if you ever hear a part of an episode and you're like, this part's really good, James, can you clip this? Please comment on the YouTube channel with a timestamp and I will happily clip it. I think that is very exciting. So definitely check out the clips channel for your pieces of this podcast. Check out Dr. Watts' work and also check out her multi-day workshop coming up in June 22nd to 26th of 2020. Accept, Connect, Embody, a psychedelic therapy framework. Bunch of links to that and other things that she mentioned, more that you can, and more about following Dr. Watts' work can be found at jameswjesso.com in the show notes to this episode. So just search 112 in the search field, or it's on the front page if this is pretty recent. So that's it. Thanks for tuning in. If you like the show and you want to directly support it, please consider becoming my patron on Patreon. People who give $8 or more get access to a private Dropbox folder, which includes both audio and video formats of the podcast without any advertising in it. Although I tend to try to be very low impact with the ads, it's an added bonus, I think, for being a patron, as well as a bunch of cool content that is not available anywhere else, or at the very least not available anywhere else without having to pass through a paywall. So please head over to patreon.com/JamesWJesso to become my patron, or jameswjesso.com/support for other options such as PayPal or buying art or t-shirts from the store. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for carrying forth what you earned in listening to this episode today into your life, and I wish you well. Take care.